Please welcome to the stage Giana Amador, Zan Fishman, and Sagatom Saha for a fireside chat on trade policy.
Hi, everyone. We are going to get started with a very exciting conversation around trade policy and what that means for carbon removal. I'll have our panelists introduce themselves. Zan, you want to start?
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, hi, everyone. I'm Giana Amador. I'm the Executive Director of the Carbon Removal Alliance. We are a coalition of some of the leading carbon removal technology developers as well as carbon removal purchasers. Our job is to translate the challenges that carbon removal companies are facing as they work to commercialize different carbon removal technologies and feed that into U.S. federal policy.
Hi, I'm Zan Fishman. I'm tired this morning. I got up at 4:20 a.m. in order to catch the train up here from DC. So if I fall asleep, I apologize in advance. But we're going to try to keep it exciting because it's trade and DAC, and what could be more exciting than that? I'm the Senior Managing Director of the Energy Program at the Bipartisan Policy Center. And as you may or may not know, the Bipartisan Policy Center, we're a DC-based think tank. And our goal is to figure out what are the policies where we can get Republicans and Democrats to come to consensus and actually pass durable legislation to tackle important challenges. And like 4 or 5 years ago, we launched a direct air capture advisory council, which has been pretty influential in many of the policy wins around 45Q and DAC hubs and procurement that we've seen enacted into law. And I also work a lot on trade policy, border carbon adjustments. So getting to combine two of my favorite topics is, what a Tuesday.
Trade is an exciting time nowadays. I'm Sagatom Saha. I'm a research scholar with the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, which is a few miles north of here. But I am based in DC and not as tired as Zan. I got in yesterday. So I spend most of my time there, where we have a relatively new, I guess a year-old at this point, a program on climate and trade where we're focused on, among a variety of things at that intersection, how can trade tools drive positive climate outcomes, and this can be a conversation about that. Also an increasingly rough environment to think about that, and we'll talk about that as well. And I came to the center at Columbia about 2.5 years ago, where I spent some time in the US government at the State Department and Commerce Department thinking about some of these issues. Excited for the conversation.
Great. And maybe to kick us off, we can do a little bit of level setting and background. For folks who are new to the topic, what's the current global policy conversation on trade, and what can we expect from the United States, the European Union, and other countries around trade in the next 6 months?
So what's the current backdrop on trade? I don't know. I'm not entirely sure anybody actually does know. There's a lot of uncertainty on trade. So in the US, President Trump has been very vocal and taken actions on imposing tariffs. Some of that has been on China, which has been a real area of bipartisan focus in terms of trade, right? I mean, there's a view that China produces goods without having the same sort of environmental standards that we have in the US, and therefore is able to produce them much more cheaply. And then we import those goods, which means we're contributing to those emissions. And we are not producing those goods here, where we would otherwise produce them with a much lower emissions intensity and higher environmental standards. And so there's a view that through trade policy we could correct that. And that's actually quite bipartisan, right? There's carbon border adjustment bills that have been introduced by both Democrats and Republicans in the US Senate. But right now, Trump's not talking about carbon border adjustments. He's talking about just tariffs, traditional tariffs. And those are different. It's really, I think it's important to keep in mind that the idea of a carbon tariff and a traditional tariff, like they kind of act the same and smell the same a little bit, but they actually are quite different, right? Executive tariffs, right now we're seeing Trump take tariffs and turn them on, turn them off, turn them on, turn them off, right? And it's hard to say what the effect of that is when you're turning tariffs on or off, right? What's the goal? Are you trying to get revenue? Are you trying to change trade flows? Are you trying to boost US manufacturing? You actually have a bunch of different goals. Are there geopolitical goals? Which goals you're trying to achieve actually matter in how you implement these policies. And I'll just say that carbon tariffs are actually quite different in that they're not like executive trade deals that you can kind of turn on and off. It's like a rule. It's like, if you have a higher emissions intensity, you will have to pay a tariff equal to this amount because of the carbon intensity. Which is a long way of saying, I don't think we're really going to know what our trade policy is for a while. A lot of uncertainty, and I'll stop there.
Yeah, uncertainty is a word. I wrote down a few more: turmoil, fracturing. And, I mean, Zane got at a very important point that I want to highlight, that there are 3 goals that I think Trump has espoused, both on the campaign trail and his first 2 months in office, for what these tariffs are for: to generate revenue, extract non-economic concessions. This is the conversation over migration and fentanyl with Canada and Mexico, or to boost domestic manufacturing. You can't do all 3 of those at once. They're inherently contradictory. And it seems like Trump will believe them at times for certain things and not at other times. And he has economic advisors that probably come from various different points of views. At some point, the dust will have to settle, and you have to choose a direction. But some of these tariffs have changed in a single, like as an anecdote, last time I saw Zam was actually about 2 weeks ago. And I think that was the day that we started in a morning where we were going to impose the tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Then there was an exemption for the big 3 automakers that afternoon. And I think by the time we went to bed, the USMCA compliant goods were not counted, and that's most of it. So there's a lot of uncertainty. But some of them are happening. We've gone from 10 to 20 on China. The tariffs on steel and aluminum, which I think we should talk more about, have also gone into effect. So some in major ways are happening, and it may seem like noise in kind of this larger conversation of, oh, maybe we do reciprocal tariffs, and maybe we have tariffs on countries that we are historically close with and are treaty allies and free trade partners. But if you take kind of the view of where were we before and what additional tariffs we have, there are already quite a few.
And I know there are a lot of companies in the audience. I'm curious for your guys' perspective on how some of these trade conversations, either from the lens of uncertainty or tariffs that, impact imported goods like steel, that a lot of these companies are going to be using to develop projects, how that might affect direct air capture companies and their ability to build projects across the globe.
I mean, in the short term, there's really no way around tariffs increasing input costs, right? In the world in which tariffs decrease the amount of imports and increase the amount of domestic production, it's because the domestic production is now able to charge a higher price to justify that production in the US. And so in the short term, that's higher prices. We could certainly make the argument that in the long term, it increases security, supply chain security. But in the short term, it certainly is gonna increase costs, and it can throw just what your supply chains are into greater turmoil. If you don't exactly know that tariff rates on normal country that you trade with are gonna be the same in a week or a day or an hour.
Yeah, in some ways, like the back and forth, I mean, you guys tell me, but it has to be the worst of both worlds, where how do you have the certainty? You have no certainty that there won't be tariffs, but you have no certainty to make the business decisions you have to make. if you knew the tariffs would be there and they would be durable. So that seems incredibly difficult. But I ended with steel and aluminum, so I guess I'll pick it back up there. In some ways, maybe that is the durable one. It's a rerun of some of the actions he took in his first term that stayed in place through the Biden administration, while other kind of the actions have been new or have gone further or gone back and forth. That seems to be the consistent one. It seems hard to build things in America if you raise the cost of steel and aluminum, both in the sense that, okay, so there are the tariffs, so the imports are higher cost, but then one, you would imagine domestic producers of steel and aluminum, which there is not an abundant supply necessarily, could also raise their costs, and it's just two different timelines. You have to build things today, and you have kind of the business decisions you make today, and whatever steel and aluminum plant they will build, if you have that certainty, say, okay, here is the new business, here is the new unit economics of producing steel here versus abroad. That is a completely different timeline. That is 2-3 years at best. And you have to do things within that timeline. And again, like, who quite knows where that goes? So higher costs, shortages, and that sort of thing. And we'll see.
Yeah. I think at the beginning, Zan, you did a great job of distinguishing between general trade policy tariffs and carbon tariffs or carbon border adjustment mechanisms. The European Union is currently working to implement a CBAM. We know other countries like the UK, Turkey, Australia, and the US have proposals or processes to scope these kinds of policies. Curious if you can give us just a little bit more kind of level setting of the state of policy around CBAMs and how we might think about embedding carbon removal into these policies.
So, so EU has a CBAM. And the implementation timeline is maybe not 100% certain, but they enacted it a couple of years ago. They started data collection, had a little bit of difficulties getting that data reporting in. They hope to start it soon. The EU CBAM is just wildly different than what we might do in the US. Right, it's based on their existing and long existing emissions trading scheme, which you could think of like a cap and trade, used to have or still has free allowances for certain industries. Those are going to go away, and it will all get replaced by this emissions trading scheme plus a carbon border adjustment. And the goal of it is to prevent carbon leakage, having the emissions occur outside of your country and get imported in, like I discussed earlier with importing stuff from China. That's the goal there. And then there's other countries who are also enacting or looking at a carbon border adjustment along those lines. In the US, what we're probably looking at is something that's not based on a economy-wide carbon price, and instead something that's based on an emissions performance standard, right? So if we make steel in the US and we make it with a certain carbon intensity, this much carbon intensity per this ton of steel, we say, all right, let's compare that to our trading partners. Turns out the US is pretty good on that front. Like, we have a carbon advantage in most of our industry, which is great. We're producing stuff cleaner, even without economy-wide, standards on emissions. And some of that is we've got, long-standing regulations. Some of that is technology improvements. Some of that's we use a lot more natural gas than coal, right? And so we're not currently getting any credit for that in trade. And you could say that our production is disadvantaged because we have heavy regulations compared to countries like China. So both Senator Cassidy from Louisiana, Republican, and Senator Whitehouse, Democrat from Rhode Island, have each introduced separate legislation, and they're in discussions about a bipartisan path, but that would use an emissions performance standard, saying if an imported good has a higher emissions intensity than the average US good of that same type, you would impose a fee on that, which is different than what the EU is doing, where it doesn't matter the relative difference of producing in the EU or elsewhere. In the EU, it's just, effectively a carbon tax on every ton of emissions embodied in that product. But this bipartisan path forward is really heartening, right? It's really interesting. It could accomplish some really good goals, and it actually could get enacted into law this year, right? They're doing a reconciliation bill. Republicans are doing a big tax bill. They need revenue. This is a policy that would actually produce revenue. We're talking like $150 billion-ish, right? Over 10 years. And so it's in play. If you paid attention to the nomination hearings for Trump's cabinet picks for Treasury, Commerce, Energy, Interior, Trade, Senator Cassidy very cleverly positioned himself on the exact right committees to ask all of those people his questions about, what do you think about my Foreign Pollution Fee Act? And he got positive responses from all of them. So it's in play.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, maybe to like put a different spin on this, the EU CBAM is really just a domestic policy. They have their domestic cap and trade. They have to have an effective carbon price. They have to extend it to industries like steel, aluminum, a few others, and to do that, they have to have, those are trade exposed industries. So they have to make sure that the price that is applied to those industries at home also applies to other countries. In some ways, that has had some real serious foreign policy problems for the Europeans, in the sense of if you have a market-driven ETS, a domestic carbon price that applies to those industries that floats between 60 to 100 euro, how do you expect Zambia, Ukraine, India, Turkey, let alone the Koreas of the world that are exposed to this to deal with it? Very difficult, and I think, are taking that feedback on board. And 2025 is actually a pretty pivotal year for the CBAM, where the reporting is in place. A lot of companies have not reported, to be frankly honest, that we're supposed to. And I think they are going through a process of simplifying this, and maybe it only applies to larger companies, and you cover most of the emissions, but has simplified reporting requirements. There is that aspect of it. And then, I mean, specific the carbon removal aspect, there are two ways for another country to get out from under a CBAM. It's to have your own domestic carbon price that is equivalent or what have you, and then you collect the revenues yourself. The other is you have fewer emissions, and that also applies to the EU companies, where it's base rated to the amount of emissions you produce. So if you produce goods with lower embedded emissions, you get out from under it. There's really no way for CDR to actually capture that, because it's like at a facility level. And the idea that kind of like there's a market for that doesn't really exist in the EU system, but I mean, talk to the Europeans, figure that out. I mean, the math still probably doesn't work. If I think the highest in the last, like, I think the highest the ETS price has been since CBAM has been like 100. So the math still doesn't work. But you imagine over a decade, that's what we were talking about in the green room, a decadal time span, you have a meeting of the price. We shall see. In a way, like the Cassidy bill, which is really like the leading edge of US policy, and there have been others. There's Shell and White House has a Clean Competition Act, which has a domestic price. Within the last administration, we were trying to negotiate something on steel and aluminum with the Europeans called the Global Arrangement on Sustainable Steel and Aluminum, where we kind of would have backdoored some version of this, and that ultimately didn't work for a variety of reasons. But the Cassidy bill is, I would say, like foreign policy, insofar as the way Zan described it, but there's also this really robust international partnerships component where if you are a developing country in particular, we can come to some sort of understanding where it's not an FTA, but we reduce or exempt you from the price, the tariff price, if XYZ, which is like pretty, I think maybe in a good way, nebulous and kind of vague for an administration to apply a foreign policy lens. So could it be something like, oh, we transferred kind of technology or learnings in this sector industry? Very well, the text accommodates that.
And there's a couple ways I think people are considering embedding carbon removal within carbon border adjustment proposals in the United States. I think one is utilizing the revenue that you mentioned as an opportunity to procure carbon removal. I think the other is thinking about carbon removal as a potential compliance option for foreign entities who are subject to these tariffs or who are having their sort of emissions measured, and as a way to sort of buy down that tariff liability. Any favorites, any kind of merits or disadvantages to those two approaches that you want to flag?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, like this is probably the best question not to answer because it's important that everyone thinks what they want is what's going to happen. I mean, Zan mentioned this briefly, but like, if there are two suppositions here. If the Cassidy bill, if you want some sort of U.S. CBAM for your own purposes, the way this would have to happen is probably the Cassidy bill. That's leading edge. It's like very well developed. It happens because it generates revenue, offsetting revenue in a reconciliation bill. It lives and dies like very likely on that point, and they'll get a score at some point. Then back of the napkin math is like 150 to 200 billion. Like a comparative number, I think cutting the EV tax credit for the IRA, which I'm not saying we should do, but it's usually pointed to as a big number, is like 200 billion. So it's within that ballpark. Personally speaking, so I spent some time with Secretary Kerry at his office in the State Department previously. It would be very useful to have that revenue to kind of do technical assistance to deploy these technologies and create markets in other countries. Once you have a B and at $1 billion, you're kind of outside the amount of money that we could avail ourselves of. So it'd go an incredible long way in other markets to deploy, kind of do export promotion and do technical assistance to other countries where you imagine in some ways that's a smaller number.
And I'll just say that as a compliance pathway, it gets very complicated because if you're talking about international trade, right? So some country is producing some good in some factory somewhere, and they're shipping it across the ocean to the United States, and you're reporting their embodied emissions, and they're going to say, we bought this much CDR, and that's going to factor into our math. As you all know, there's a whole wild west of CDR out there, and some of it is high quality. DAC tends to be the high quality CDR, not the only high quality CDR, but one of the higher quality CDRs, obviously. But there's certainly low quality CDR. And figuring out how to police that internationally in order to impose a tariff at a port could be complicated. Which is why, at least in the near term, I really like the idea of devoting a portion of revenues, maybe 5%, maybe 10%, I don't know, some number, a portion of the revenues to funding the federal CDR procurement program, which could really use a dedicated funding stream.
And I mean, you have an answer of your own, right? Like from the domestic lens of political will, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's possible in the current U.S. legislative proposals, because that revenue is going to be pulled in a million directions, is having carbon removal as a compliance option could generate really meaningful demand for a whole broad diversity of carbon removal technologies. I think the devil is in the details, and the challenges around aligning international MRV standards is extremely difficult. That's difficult to do even domestically, and is something that DOE was building the foundation for in the Carbon Dioxide Removal Purchasing Prize. I think it also brings into question Article 6 and how this fits into nationally determined contributions and who gets to count credit for this. I think there's also a longer history of people purchasing low-quality offsets that aren't even carbon removal. They're emissions reductions or emissions avoidance offsets. And so I think there needs to be some mechanism that distinguishes between these sort of different compliance pathways, and I think ensures that we are purchasing durable, high-quality carbon removal and upholding some of these principles around like for like, which essentially means, if we're putting a ton of emissions into the atmosphere for 1,000 years, we need to make sure, and we're making a compensation claim, we need to make sure that we're storing carbon on similar time scales with similar quality. So that is a really difficult design challenge. It likely means building out that expertise and infrastructure within the US federal government in a way that doesn't exist now, and it didn't exist under the Biden administration. So it's not an easy policy implementation question, but I think it's one pathway that has potential political traction. Go ahead.
I was just going to compliment Saga on making you answer the question. That was really good. Yeah.
We have about 5 minutes. Anything else that you two want to add, or any questions from the audience?
Can't tell you what's gonna happen tomorrow.
Yeah, I think we have someone with a mic right here.
My own personal mic, I love it. So my question is this, if the United States, which I'm very confident is going to become the primary direct carbon capture nation in the world, therefore we will have a predominant capability of using the carbon that we capture as sort of a carbon tariff against incoming goods from other nations that can't capture as much carbon as we can. Would that somehow be able to massage the Trump administration into some form of more malleable tariff situations that he just seems to like to throw out the door like baseball bats?
So it's a really great question. What I would say is that the reason why the Trump admin seems like it could be open to a border carbon policy is not because they particularly care about the CO2 emissions. It's because of the base case economics and foreign policy implications align with their general worldview, right? Cassidy's bill is called the foreign pollution fee, right? Great name, just a terrific name. Like, okay, it's a foreign pollution fee. Well, okay, but why are we actually focusing on the carbon if there's other kinds of pollution? Well, the answer is because that's where our metrics are so much better than our trading partners, right? Like, it's actually much cheaper for them to get cleaner in terms of like traditional pollutants than it is for them to match our level of emissions. So it's just a pure economic case of like, this is a thing that happens to be defensible on environmental grounds, would in fact help global emissions, and improves the economics of US manufacturing and the trade goals that President Trump and his administration have, right? That's why it all works. So the question I think that you're asking is, can DAC contribute to decreasing the average emissions intensity of US production in order to increase the delta with our trading partners? And I think that's a really good question. You could answer it either way, right? And the policy design really matters on all this stuff. But like, do you want it to be the case that steel manufacturer in Pennsylvania says, this is our carbon intensity at our factory, and we've purchased this much DAC, do the math, this is now our standard? Or do you want it to be the case that the standard is just based on the steel? Right, that's the question you're asking. I'm not sure that I have a good answer for you, but I do think it's worth thinking about.
I feel like we spend endless time in conference rooms in DC talking about product, facility, and company level measurement of all this stuff. But I think kind of the overarching point in your question is, okay, could you, if you have something like the Foreign Pollution Fee Act in hand, does that kind of maybe displace some of the other more, one would argue, irrational tariff policy we've had? I truly suspect not. It seems like the Trump administration is interested in levying tariffs for any and all reasons with a pretty strong focus on trade balances. But you'd imagine if this would be a useful tool you want to have as you move toward a more rational trade policy. And part of this is like two asides, but perhaps useful. It's really not clear what authority that he's drawing from to levy a lot of these tariffs. There is the International Economic Powers Act that has been invoked specifically for fentanyl. The word tariff is never mentioned in that bill, and then kind of these other tariff authorities that are imbued from other, like the Trade Policy Act and others, require reviews that have not been done. So we'll see how that plays out over the long term. But this would be an explicit authority if there's some other bill passed on a carbon tariff that would be a long-term durable policy. And the other, like the math that Zan is referring to is pretty well reviewed. Actually, like Katrina, there's an organization called the Climate Leadership Council that has done this math. And they actually updated it like literally today. I got an email in my inbox. So if you want to look up Climate Leadership Council, Carbon Advantage, you'll have, I haven't even read it yet, so you can perhaps read it before I do.
Maybe time for one more question? Any? And if not, oh, I think we have one right here.
Thank you, guys. Great discussion. I think the Climate Leadership Council, they were promoting a carbon fee and dividend policy that Canada had implemented and I believe has just been partially cut, right? And I just wondered if you guys could kind of expand on what the potential is for something like that and what the implications are of it being dismantled in Canada.
And I can be brief. Like, I think that's really instructive. And I mean, there are other things that have happened domestically at the state and local level and in Australia. The idea of outside of Europe, they seem to figure it out, like a really durable domestic carbon price that actually like moves the needle. Seems very hard anywhere in the world. Don't think we're going to do it here. So if you hinge, like there is the White House, Senator Sheldon White House bill. If you want to do this with a domestic carbon price, that seems like you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot to get off the bench. So there are ways to do it without it that can be still beneficial.
Yeah, I think a carbon fee or a carbon tax economy-wide in the US is not something that's realistic anytime in the near future.
And I think that's all our time. Please join me in thanking our panelists.